I have a friend who was talking to me last week about Choice City Church. How's the church going? And he grew up in a different church background than what Choice City is. And he said, well, so do you guys think like someday you'll actually like build a church? And what do you think he meant by that? He meant a building, right? You think someday you'll build a building? Because that's kind of like when a church becomes, well, that's what a church is, right? Well, maybe not actually. So I said, well, you know, I don't know. I mean, maybe someday we would have a building. But I said, you know what I'm really excited about? See, God has this mission. God has this agenda in the world. And He wants to raise up people to pursue that agenda. And so I'm not as concerned about whether or not we have a building. I'm concerned about whether or not we have people who are mindful of God's mission. I believe that there are people who are living their lives without a sense that they're a part of something significant. I see my role as a person who tries to stir that up so that you and I are both a part of something way bigger than ourselves. I said, imagine if there was a platoon. Who's in charge of a platoon in the military? A captain, a manager? Not a manager. Chief, a captain, a sergeant, I don't know. Some sort of leader, right? Imagine if I were, a sergeant of a platoon, and here's the platoon. And what if the whole purpose of what we do is for me to get up here and to just lead everything? And that's what we do. The Army sits down, and I get up here and I talk to you. And then we leave, and then we come back next week, and I get up here and talk. That just wouldn't make any sense in a military setting. The purpose of getting up here is to what? Rally the troops, train the troops, prepare the troops, so that the troops are ready for the mission. So I said to my friend, I'm not so much concerned about building a building, I'm concerned about raising an army. That's what I care about. That's my job. My job as a pastor is to not get up here and do all the work. It's to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. I want us to be useful in the work of God. What does it take to be useful? That's what we're going to look at today. In John chapter 9. Let me give you a little bit of context of what's happened. We've only looked at the first 7 verses so far. And here's what happened last week when we looked at the first 7 verses. There was a man who was born blind. He's been blind his whole life. Jesus goes to him, and he says, this man has been born blind for the sake of God performing some great works in his life. And so here I am. I've come to do those works, and God's going to get glory through this man's disability. God's going to show Himself to be a good God through this man's disability. And so Jesus spits on the ground, and mixes the spit and the dust, makes some mud, anoints the man's eyes, tells him to go to the pool of Siloam, wash his eyes, and the guy does it. He goes and he washes his eyes, and he comes back seeing. So that's the setting of everything that we're going to look at today. And here's what happens. There are kind of 5 responses, I guess we're going to look at. There's a response of the guy's neighbors. There's a response of the Pharisees. There's a response of the guy's parents. There's the response of the healed man himself, and then Jesus kind of steps back and He gives His assessment of the whole situation. So we're going to look at those 5 things. We're going to cover a ton of territory. We're going to try to actually finish the chapter. So I almost never preach this much of a text on a Sunday, because I like to do smaller chunks. But this is narrative, and so in order to really feel the story, you kind of need to take this in a big chunk. This is a great story. We're going to try to cruise through 5 paragraphs, the rest of chapter 9. So let's do it. We're going to start with paragraph number 1, which is going to be verses 8 through 12. And in this paragraph, what we're primarily looking at is the response of the man's neighbors. So check it out, John chapter 9, verse 8. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he's like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Then how were your eyes open?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." There it is. The response of the neighbors. There's this interchange between the neighbors and the man. They're familiar with his condition. They know that he was born blind. They're familiar with his lifestyle. They know that he's been a beggar. In verses 8 and 9, we find that there's a division between the neighbors. Some of them say, "Is this really the guy?" Other people are like, "No, it's just a look-alike." He's like, "Hey, ask me. I'm the guy." He keeps kind of defending, he's defending that I am the blind man who's been healed. And so then they ask him to just tell us what happened. He gives an account in verse 11, pretty straightforward. The man called Jesus, made mud, anointed my eyes, said to me, "Go to Siloam and wash." So I went and washed, I received my sight. That's what happened. So the neighbors want to meet Jesus. In verse 12, they want to go meet this guy. And the man is actually fairly ignorant. The man called Jesus, that's really all he knows. He knows his name. He actually hasn't seen him yet. We'll come back to a little bit later. The man called Jesus did these things. So he knows what his name is, and he knows what happened to him. And that's really all that he knows. So, because he doesn't know where Jesus is at, we can't go talk to Jesus. The neighbors kind of do the next best thing. Well, let's go talk to the religious authorities. So that's our second paragraph. Let's look at the response of the Pharisees in verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now, it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" He said, "He's a prophet." Okay, so they bring him to the Pharisees. The neighbors bring him to the Pharisees. This is not necessarily like an ill-intentioned thing that they've done. This would be kind of expected. Something of this magnitude, this astonishing, would be something you want the religious leaders to weigh in on, especially in a society that's kind of arranged around a high level of religious, social existence. The whole society is a religious society. Get the Pharisees, the highest level of leaders in the country, to weigh in on this. And so they bring him to the leaders. And then John tells us in verse 14, very important piece of background information. This healing takes place on the Sabbath. Now the Sabbath is Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown in Jewish culture. And the Sabbath is a day that God has commanded that His people are not supposed to work on those days. And there were certain types of things that the religious authorities considered to be work because of their oral tradition. The Jews had a long oral tradition that helped them kind of think through some of the particulars of what it meant to not break the Sabbath, for example. So because of their oral tradition, they had beliefs about certain kinds of things that were considered work that Jesus has now done, that in their minds makes them think he's violated the Sabbath because he's broken not the Torah, but the oral traditions. For example, the Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A, I think that's it. I don't think there's an H in it. Mishnah. Okay, so the Mishnah is these oral traditions were finally written down about 200 AD. And they were written down in what we call the Mishnah. So we can go back to the Mishnah, we can read about the oral traditions, which the Jews traced all the way back to the days of Moses. They said the oral traditions have been around since the days of Moses. And the Mishnah says that on the Sabbath, here are a list of things that you're not allowed to do. And one of them is kneading. Kneading. K-N-E-A-D-I-N-G. Like the way you would knead a lump of dough. Or spit and mud to make, or spit and dirt to make mud. In other words, it may have been the mud making that these guys are upset about. That's probably what explains verse 14. Listen to the way that John explains that it's the Sabbath. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So mud making, kneading something, even if it was spittle and dirt, is a violation in their minds of the Sabbath because of their oral traditions. There's another thing that wasn't allowed, at least by some rabbis. We can go back to another piece of ancient literature called the Babylonian Talmud, where we hear rabbis talking about different things that they believe about the Mishnah. It's kind of complicated. Some of the rabbis thought you're not allowed to anoint eyes on the Sabbath. And some rabbis said, well, no, it's okay under certain conditions, and they thought about this kind of stuff. So at least for those two reasons, what Jesus has done violates, in their minds, the Sabbath, which they're going to interpret as a breaking of God's law, which isn't actually the case. I want to make that really clear. What Jesus has done does not break Old Testament law. It breaks tradition. It breaks oral tradition. So it's important to know that that's what's going on here, and that this took place on the Sabbath, because John is trying to help us understand what triggers the resistance of the religious leaders in this situation. Because they're very resistant to this healing. Well, it's because it took place on the Sabbath, and Jesus is violating oral tradition. So here he is, the man's brought to the leaders, they ask him for an account, and for now the second time, the man gives an account of what happened. Verse 15, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. And then there's a division among the Pharisees. They don't know what to make of it. Some of them believe this guy is definitely breaking the Sabbath, which is valid if their oral traditions are authoritative. Now, Jesus in other places like Mark chapter 7, Matthew chapter 15, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees repeatedly because they will elevate their oral tradition over God's law, over the Bible. So these guys are taking their law they're taking oral tradition as authoritative. That's the problem here. So they're thinking, okay, this guy's broken the Sabbath. Others of them are just looking at the sign itself, and they're thinking, I don't know, man. I don't know. This is a pretty amazing thing. This is godlike power on display in this guy's life. So I don't know if we can argue with what's happened here. So I guess notice that you have a division, not only among the neighbors, you also have a division among the Pharisees, among the religious leaders. They're not sure what to make of what Jesus has done here. They're not sure what to make of this healing. So the Pharisees, it's kind of funny to me, in verse 17, they actually asked the blind man to give an interpretation. Which probably, what they're doing is they're probably just telling him to take a side. And he kind of splits the middle and goes above and beyond what any of them were expecting, choose a side, and he makes this assessment. Oh, he's a prophet. Which, it's kind of funny. I'm not worried about your traditional rules about the Sabbath. I don't really care about all these little details. This guy healed my eyes. As far as I know, he must be from God. I say he's a prophet. Well, this gets very messy for the Pharisees, because this claim, you can't have this guy going around town saying after this miraculous healing that this potential lawbreaker is a prophet of God. And so this actually kind of has the effect of unifying the Pharisees in their resistance to Jesus, which is what we're going to see throughout the rest of the chapter. They, at this point, it's very interesting, they kind of figure, well, you know how we could make this problem go away? What if we could establish that he wasn't blind in the first place? Because if he wasn't blind in the first place, then the miracle didn't really happen, and then the problem goes away. Maybe the neighbors don't know him as well as they think they know him. We need to talk to his parents, because his parents will truly know what's going on. So that's what they do. They bring in the parents, and that's the third paragraph. And here we get to see the response of the parents to this healing. We've seen the neighbors, we've seen the beginnings of the Pharisees' response. Here's the parents, verse 18. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight. They didn't believe it until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." Verse 22. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." Okay, so if the blind man was never blind, then the whole problem goes away. But once the blind man's parents testify that he was in fact born blind, in verse 20, we're back to the dilemma. So how do we explain this? And they get kind of desperate at this point. They ask his parents, "Can you explain how the miracle happened?" Verse 19, how did this happen? And their response is, "I don't know, ask him." So they don't even try to answer the question of how the miracle took place. Now what's really, revealing here is that it seems that the parents actually do know what went on. They actually know what happened, but the reason they don't say anything is because they're scared to attribute it to Jesus for fear of being kicked out of the local synagogue, so they just throw their son under the bus. Because guess what's going to happen to him? He's going to get kicked out of the synagogue if he confesses Christ. They're like, "Yeah, whatever." They throw him under the bus. They ask him. And so the conversation now goes back to the healed man himself, which brings us now to our fourth paragraph. Watch how the healed man now responds to this. And we're continuing to see the Pharisees as well, but especially look at the response of the man himself, starting in verse 24. So for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "Whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You are born in utter sin, would you teach us? And they cast him out. Wow. Okay, so they're hoping to get like more information. They talk to the parents. Parents don't have anything to say. They go back to the healed man. They press him now to testify before God. Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. Okay? God knows the truth here. You're like almost like putting you under oath is what's happening here. God knows the truth here, buddy. Fess up. We know you're hiding something. The man is a sinner. That's clear. Because he did this on the Sabbath. So you can see at this point they're no longer divided in their assessment of Jesus. Even if they couldn't agree at first, they're all rallying around this belief that he's definitely broken the Sabbath, he's a sinner, and here's the simple testimony of the man. I'm no theologian here. Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. Here's what I know. I was blind, now I see. That's what I know. And that's pretty much the end of it for him. He's not really interested in investigating the validity of Jesus any further. He's totally convinced. He's convinced. And that kind of gives them a choice here. Maybe only one choice. You can spin in circles here. I mean, they've kind of exhausted everything, but they try to cover the same ground already. They ask him to once again tell us how this happened, and this is the fourth time that this question's been asked now, and it kind of kicks him off into this like offensive, sarcastic posture toward them. And he suggests that perhaps their repeated questioning isn't because they are opposed to Jesus, but maybe, tongue-in-cheek, maybe they secretly desire to become disciples of Jesus. They hate him for that. They reviled him, saying, verse 28, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. Now what's that about? We're disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses. But as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. Okay, what's the connection to Moses? Sabbath. They think that they're being faithful to Moses by assessing Jesus according to this broken Sabbath problem. So they're siding with Moses. They think that Jesus is against Moses. But this guy, he's healed. And he's got good spiritual instincts, or maybe a better way to say it at this point is he's just got some common sense. There's something about what Jesus is doing that's just really self-evident. If this man weren't from God, he could do nothing. I mean, look what he did. Frankly, he seems to be the only level-headed person speaking in the whole conversation, right? He doesn't know all the details of the tradition. He doesn't care about all the details of the tradition. But when he's seeing for the first time in his life through his eyes, he doesn't really care what people are saying about Jesus. I say he's a prophet. I say he's from God. And all the people who are arguing against him actually end up looking pretty stupid, don't they? Right? Because the uninformed, beggar, blind man seems to know what he's talking about. And the highly trained religious leaders are running in circles trying to find a way to discredit what is perfectly obvious. The blind man can see, and those who claim to see are actually blind. That's the great irony in this whole passage. Who can really see? So, their very last resort is an abusive and proud power play. They kind of insult him. You're a sinner. You can't teach anybody anything. And they kick him out of the synagogue. For what? For being healed by Jesus, for believing in Jesus, and for testifying to that belief. They kick him out of the synagogue because he believes and testifies of Jesus Christ. Apparently that's what spiritually blind people can end up doing to people who can see the spiritual reality of the God of the Bible. Now, before we go on to the next paragraph, the final paragraph of the chapter, I want to draw your attention to something. Some of you may remember in a very similar type of incident happened in John chapter 5. In chapter 5, Jesus was in Jerusalem, and he healed a man who had been an invalid for 38 years, which was just short of kind of the life expectancy. He'd been paralyzed. Jesus meets him at this pool, and he says to the guy, "Do you want to be healed?" And the guy kind of complains about, like, "Well, nobody can take me down to the water when it's, for the healing." And Jesus is like, "Okay, whatever. Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And the man gets up. He takes his bed, and he starts walking, and he's carrying his bed around town. And the Pharisees, and it's the Sabbath. And the Pharisees see him carrying his bed. And this too breaks one of their oral traditions. And so they're like, "What are you doing? You're breaking the Sabbath." And he's like, "Well, this guy told me to take up my bed and walk." He kind of throws Jesus under the bus. And so they kind of rough him up a little bit. And then after the Pharisees have this talk with him, Jesus catches up with him afterwards in the temple. Actually, here's what happened. Let me I missed the story. So they rough him up a little bit. They say, "Who did this to you?" And he says, "I don't know." That's what happened. He said, "I don't know." Because after Jesus had healed him, Jesus kind of blended into the crowd. So they rough him up. Afterwards, Jesus goes and finds him in the temple. And he says, "See, you're healed. Now go and sin no more, so that nothing worse happens to you." So that's chapter 5, verse 14. And in other words, like stop living in rebellion to God. Follow me. Turn, follow me. Do you know what the guy does? He doesn't thank him. He doesn't follow him. Chapter 5, verse 15. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. He turns him into the authorities. The man who healed him, he turns him into the authorities. The pressure of not being liked by the important people in society presses down on his ungrateful heart, and out comes betrayal. It's a pretty different response than the blind man's, isn't it? And I want you to see this because there's another similarity here. Just like the paralyzed man, the blind man, he gets roughed up by the officials. That's what we've just been looking at. And yet he continues to defend Jesus. He doesn't accuse Jesus. He defends and he defends until he's kicked out of the synagogue. And the important people didn't matter to him if he was being forced to compromise what he was coming to believe was the most important person. And so he's been roughed up by the officials, and Jesus does the same thing. He catches up with him. He finds him. They have a little follow-up discussion. And I want you to notice the difference between the healed blind man's response and the healed paralyzed man's response. And it's in the last paragraph here. And the other thing we see in this last paragraph, verses 35 to 41, is the response of Jesus himself. Watch this. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, and those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." Okay, so Jesus hears that the guy gets kicked out of the synagogue. And he tracks him down, and And he asks him if he's a believer in the Son of Man, which is one of the common ways that Jesus would refer to himself. And what's really interesting about this is at this point we start to realize that the man who's been given sight has actually never seen the healing. Because Jesus anointed, remember, he anointed his eyes with the mud. He sends him to the pool to wash, and then there's no meeting after that between the two of them. He comes back and his neighbor starts to heal. He comes back seeing. He actually hasn't seen Jesus yet. Yeah, he doesn't know what he looks like. Yeah, who is he, sir? The thing is, his heart has already seen Jesus. He's already convinced. He's already defended Jesus. He defended Jesus fiercely to the point of being rejected from the greatest institution on planet Earth at the time and the highest reigning religious authorities who were thought to have had the greatest contact with God himself. He resists that in the face of incredible persecution from them because he already sees Jesus. He already loves Jesus, though he has not laid eyes on him. Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? I want to believe in him. I'm ready to believe in him. Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. He said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. It's such a different response. It's such a beautiful response to the man who just gave his body life. Because his heart has seen the glory of the Lord. Now, at this point, we shift to Jesus, and Jesus gives us an assessment of the entire chapter. Here's what's going on in chapter 9. Jesus interprets chapter 9 for us in verse 39. Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. What's happening here is that Jesus is dealing with this chapter not mainly with the eyes of the flesh, but with darkened hearts. That's what's going on in this chapter. The real blindness that this healing and these dialogues are illustrating is not a blindness of the eyes, it's a blindness of the heart. It's a spiritual blindness. And the entire scene is illustrating the difference between a heart that can see and a heart that can't see. The whole chapter is putting that on display. According to Jesus, the heart that sees is a heart that accepts Jesus, and the heart that can't see is a heart that rejects Jesus. Jesus is the dividing line of humanity. And in that sense, Jesus brings a judgment to the earth. For this reason I came into the world, he says in verse, 39, for judgment. He's a dividing line. He opens the eyes of the heart, and he becomes a dividing line. And it doesn't matter how enlightened you think you are. It doesn't matter if you've studied spirituality all of your life. It doesn't matter if you've studied world religions all of your life. It doesn't matter if you've studied psychology all of your life or human behavior all of your life. According to Jesus, the way that you respond to Jesus reveals whether or not you truly see. So Jesus will heal the hearts of many who are in darkness. They will accept Jesus, and it will prove that they can actually see. And many will claim that they already see. There are people in this room that claim they can already see. But the way that they respond to Jesus demonstrates, wow, are you in darkness? See, he's the dividing line. Your claims mean nothing. Do you accept Jesus or do you reject Jesus? That determines whether or not you really see. Some of the Pharisees heard him, verse 40. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, are we also blind? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. They're in a very dangerous situation because they claim to see, but they're rejecting Jesus. This is the deadliness of spiritual pride. So, wow. Okay, what do we do with all this? Good story. Great story. I mean, I should just end right there because I'm like, okay, that's just the story. Beautiful. I think there's a couple things we can do that will help us just kind of apply this to our life. We can ask the question, when we look at this passage, what does spiritual blindness produce in a person's life? And we can ask the question, what does spiritual sight produce in a person's life? And then we can look at this passage and just kind of glean from it. So, a couple things spiritual blindness produces in a person's life. And we could be talking about spiritual blindness in kind of the definitive sense where you've never come to know Jesus. Or you could be talking about spiritual blindness that still is kind of the remnants of, in a Christian's life, the remnants of the old life, the remnants of the old man. It's still pressing the flesh, it's still pressing against the reality of the Spirit in our lives. We Christians are not free from these things in the sense that we never experience them any longer. We would just say when Jesus opens the eyes, the decisive transformation has taken place, and we're on a new path now, and glory is our destiny. But we're still battling against these things. So what does blindness look like? Whether you're totally blind, or whether you follow Jesus and you're still working through the remnants of darkness in your heart. Two things. One, spiritual blindness produces pride. Spiritual blindness produces pride. Thinking more highly of ourselves than we should. Specifically, it produces this stubborn confidence that we know more than Jesus knows. Thereby producing in us resistance to Jesus. Perhaps a blatant rejection of Him, criticism of what He's doing, criticism of His Word, and unwillingness to have our framework reshaped by Jesus. I mean, if Jesus is doing a healing on the Sabbath and my theology of the Sabbath doesn't make sense of that, the problem is with my theology, not with Jesus. Right? Jesus is not the problem. I'm the problem. And if I'm resistant to Jesus, it demonstrates that I'm not seeing things very clearly. Because I seem to be thinking that I know better than the Lord of glory. When you're in a state of spiritual blindness, in pride, we will be resistant to the Jesus of the Bible, to His teachings, to His ways. It's one of the danger signs of a blinded heart. That's one of the things that a blind heart will produce in a person's life. Here's another thing that blindness will produce in a person's heart. Spiritual blindness will cause you to buckle under the fear of man. And I'm thinking here of the paralyzed man who is healed, and I'm thinking of the parents of the blind man. In both cases, they saw Jesus do amazing works, and yet, under the pressure of being rejected by society's most important people, they reject Jesus. They accuse Jesus. They refuse to confess Jesus. The invalid turns Jesus in. The parents refuse to publicly acknowledge Him as the Christ. And they turn their own backs. The parents do. They turn their own backs on their child in the process. I mean, they're being dominated by this fear of what people will think about them. Why would they do that? After all that Jesus has done, why would they fold? It's because, just like the Pharisees, they're oblivious to what's obvious. Because they're blind to the reality of who Jesus is. And therefore, they don't believe it's worth the cost. It's not worth being kicked out of the synagogue. It's not worth being rejected by the officials. What would people think of me? They buckle under the fear. Now, what if that's you? What if that's me? In pride, resisting Jesus, or seeing myself buckling under fear of Him. What do you do? What can you do? A couple of things. I'm going to take us back to the confession that we prayed earlier. April, you got that for me. Here's what we can do. Actually, would you read this aloud with me one more time? Oh, my Savior, help me. I am slow to learn, prone to forget, weak to climb. I am in the foothills, sloth in the heavenly race, my stained conscience, my wasted hours, my unspent opportunities. I am blind while the light shines all around me. Take the scales from my eyes. Grind to dust my heart of unbelief. Make it my highest joy to study you, meditate on you, gaze on you, sit like Mary at your feet. Meditate on you, I think. Where is this where we are? Yeah. Okay. Lean like John on your breast. Appeal like Peter to your love. Count like Paul all things as done. I believe. Help. Help. Help my unbelief, Lord. Amen. What can you do? You can confess and you can ask for help. And that's where we got to start. Linger there. Don't try to do something to fix yourself. You can't fix this in yourself. You're blind. Christian, there are remnants of our blindness, and we can't fix it. But we can look at it. We can ask forgiveness. We can look at it. We can ask for help. Take the scales off my eyes. Heal me. Our only hope is healing. Okay, those are a couple of signs of things that happen in the life of a person who is blind to the glory of Jesus. Now, as we look at this passage, what does spiritual sight produce? And I'm going to close with three things here. Number one, spiritual sight produces worship of Jesus. Spiritual sight produces worship of Jesus. Rather than criticism, rather than resistance, rather than betrayal, what we see in this man is a heart that has come into the light and he delights in Jesus. We see an eagerness for Jesus in this man. What this guy experienced even before he laid physical eyes on Jesus, it reminds me of what Peter says is our experience. Because we haven't laid on physical eyes on Jesus yet, have we? We are all in the same state that this guy was in before he laid physical eyes on him. Listen to the way that Peter talks about the Christian who has yet to see. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 8. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory. That's worship. And it happens when you see Jesus with the eyes of the heart. Which is the only way we're seeing him right now. Until glory. To love him, to believe in him, to rejoice, to have joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory. That's what happens in the life of a person who has actually seen Jesus with the eyes of the heart. Some days it's high, some days it's low, but it's there. Worship is one of the things that happens. Secondly, spiritual sight produces humble conviction. This guy could not be swayed. He's seen something. He could not be swayed. His perspective was not that he knew more than Jesus. He believed that he had no right to disagree with Jesus after what he's seen. He was enslaved, you might say, to Jesus. He could not turn because he has seen. How could he possibly argue with this healer? He had been utterly humble. Even under pressure, the guy's not going to budge. Humble conviction. He has humble conviction. They make him swear before God. They pressure him to call Jesus a sinner. They tell him to repeat his story. He's bolder and bolder and bolder. He doesn't care what they do to him. He's not going to renounce the man who clearly knows what he's doing. And in humility, he loves Jesus. And rather than buckles under that strength, this guy stands, he testifies, he perseveres under trial. Because he's seen him. His eyes have been healed. The eyes of his heart have been healed. And therefore, a third thing that spiritual sight produces is this: usefulness. your usefulness before God. How much training does this guy have? In evangelism? Or apologetics? Right? Don't know. Nothing. This man is the most unequipped Christian on the face of the planet at this moment. There's not another Christian on the planet that is more ignorant of Jesus than this guy. And more unequipped. He's the worst, right? He only knew the guy's name at the beginning of the day, but he has eyes to see Jesus, and because of that, he has a heart of worship, he has deep conviction, and because of that, he is usable. Christ can use this guy, so God uses him as an instrument to testify in the face of pressure. And how many millions of people have seen this guy's brilliant response over the centuries for the past 2,000 years as people study and read and preach the Gospel of John. This man was used mightily. I want you to be used mightily in the work of the Lord. You want to be used? I want to be used, which means we have to see. We have to see. So what can we do? We can look and linger and pray. Wake me up. I want to be used. I want to be a worshiper. I want to have a conviction. I want to be used. Would you?